When your own child forgets your birthday once, you brush it off as life being busy. When it happens twice, you tell yourself he's just overwhelmed. But when it happens for the 5th year in a row, on the same date that hasn't changed since the day I was born, something inside you changes. Something cold. It was a quiet morning. My 61st birthday. I sat at the kitchen table, watching the sunlight creep across the floorboards. There was a single slice of chocolate cake on a plate in front of me, the one I'd picked up the night before from the bakery down the street. I didn't bother with candles this year. The room was silent, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. A gift from my late wife, decades ago. My phone buzzed twice that morning. The first was a notification from my bank. The second was a spam message about car insurance. Not a single call. Not a single text from my son, Ethan. It shouldn't have hurt anymore, but it did. The boy I had raised. The boy whose college tuition I'd paid. Whose every stumble I had softened. Couldn't take 30 seconds to send a message. He used to make me cards when he was little. Crayon drawings with uneven letters. "Happy birthday, Dad," written proudly across the top. I still had them tucked away in a box upstairs. By noon, I had finished my coffee, my cake, and my patience. That's when my phone rang. Ethan's name flashed across the screen. For a second, my heart lifted. Maybe he hadn't forgotten after all. Maybe this year would be different. "Hey, Dad," he said cheerfully, his voice bright and careless. "Ethan," I replied evenly. "Listen," he began. "I've been meaning to talk to you. The expansion for my company's ready. We've got a great investor lined up, but we're still a little short on capital. If you could transfer the last installment this week, that'd really help. I'll pay you back within the year, promise." Not a word about my birthday. Not one. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window. "Tell me something, Ethan," I said quietly. "What's today?" He hesitated. Wednesday." The silence that followed was heavier than I expected. I felt something deep inside me finally give way. Years of disappointment, of excuses, of telling myself he'd grow up. All of it came crashing down in one cold realization. "Wednesday," I repeated softly. "That's right." He didn't notice the tone. He was too busy talking about projections, market potential, and investor confidence. My son, my flesh and blood, treated me like an ATM with a voice. When he finally paused for breath, I said, "Ethan, don't worry about the transfer. I'll take care of it." "Really? That's great, Dad. I knew I could count on you." "You always could," I said. "Happy Wednesday." He laughed lightly, still oblivious, and hung up. I stared at the phone for a long time after the line went dead. Then I opened my laptop and logged into my accounts. Every one of them. The trust I'd built for him, the funds I'd set aside for his business, the accounts he didn't even know I controlled. I began making changes. Quiet, deliberate changes. By the end of the afternoon, Ethan's company funding had vanished. Legally, of course, I simply pulled my investments, froze transfers, and redirected assets into other ventures under my own management. Nothing unethical, just business. That evening, I poured myself a glass of whiskey and stepped out onto the porch. The air was cool and sharp, carrying the scent of pine and rain. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and the world felt beautifully indifferent. A week later, Ethan called again. This time, his voice wasn't so cheerful. "Dad, the deal fell through. The investors backed out when the transfer didn't come through." "What happened?" "I canceled it," I said simply. "What? Why would you do that?" he demanded, his tone sharp, almost indignant. I let the silence hang before replying. "Because you forgot my birthday. Again." He scoffed. "Come on, Dad, you can't be serious. You're punishing me over a date." "No," I said slowly. "I'm reminding you what matters. You've been so focused on money, success, and status that you've forgotten the man who taught you how to dream in the first place. You treat me like a checkbook, Ethan, not a father." He didn't speak for a long moment. When he finally did, his voice had softened. "I'm sorry, Dad. I didn't mean—" I interrupted him. "Don't apologize because you lost something. Apologize because you forgot someone." He tried to recover, to explain, to rationalize, but I'd already made my peace. The money would stay where it was, in trust for his son. My grandson. The boy who still sent me drawings on my birthday. As the years went on, Ethan's company folded. He started smaller ventures, but none lasted long. Eventually, he found stability not through wealth but through humility. And one winter morning, years later, I woke up to a knock on my door. It was Ethan. He looked older, tired, but different, softer somehow. In his hands, he held a cake. Chocolate with 6 candles. "I didn't forget this time," he said quietly. I smiled. "That's good," I said, "because neither did I." We sat at the table, the same one where I had once eaten alone. This time, it was filled with laughter, stories, and the warmth I had missed for so long. And as he handed me a slice of cake, I realized something. Sometimes, the best revenge isn't cruel. It's kind. It's the lesson that stings, but heals. He learned. I forgave. And for the first time in 5 long years, my birthday finally meant something again. We sat there for hours that evening, the clock ticking softly in the background, the candles flickering low between us. It wasn't like before, when conversations were easy and full of laughter, but it wasn't strained either. It was something new, honest. Ethan kept glancing at me, like he was still waiting for me to scold him, to remind him of everything he'd done wrong. But I didn't. The truth was, I'd already let go of the anger. The years had taught me that resentment doesn't punish anyone but the one who carries it. He cleared his throat. "Dad," he began, his voice hesitant. "I was stupid. I know that now. I took you for granted. I thought money, success, all of that would make you proud. But I forgot why I started any of it. I forgot you." I nodded slowly, taking another sip of coffee. "And what made you remember?" He smiled faintly. "Losing everything." He laughed softly, shaking his head. "It's funny, isn't it? I built my whole life around numbers and deals, but the one thing I couldn't put a price on was time. And I wasted years of it." "Time's generous," I said quietly. "It always gives us one more chance. The trick is to recognize it when it comes." He looked up, his eyes glassy but steady. "Do I get one?" I studied him for a long moment. Not the man in front of me, but the boy I used to carry on my shoulders, the kid who once said I was his hero. I saw both of them now, the pride and the mistakes, the arrogance and the love buried underneath it all. "Yes," I said finally. "You do." He exhaled, a sound halfway between relief and disbelief. We didn't talk about business after that. We didn't need to. We talked about my late wife, about the cabin we used to visit in the summers, about how his son, my grandson, had taken to painting just like his grandmother. It felt like rediscovering something we'd both thought was gone forever. When it grew late, Ethan stood and hesitated by the door. "Dad," he said softly, "thank you for not giving up on me." I smiled, the kind of small, quiet smile that comes from deep down. "I almost did," I admitted. "But your mother wouldn't have let me." He laughed under his breath, nodding. "She'd have called me an idiot. She'd have been right." We both laughed then, really laughed. And in that sound, I heard the last of the distance between us disappear. After he left, I sat back down at the table. The cake was half eaten. The candles melted down to stubs. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the loneliness pressing in. I felt peace. I picked up the last slice and smiled to myself. 5 years of silence, 5 years of waiting, and it had all led to this. Not revenge, not punishment, just understanding. The next morning, I went to my office and made one final change to my will. The trust fund remained, but now, the note attached to it read, "For Ethan," to remind him that time is worth more than money, and love is worth more than pride. Months later, he invited me to his home for dinner. His wife greeted me warmly. His son ran to show me his latest drawing, a picture of Grandpa and Dad fixing things together. I hung it on my fridge the next day. As the years passed, birthdays became different. They weren't about gifts or phone calls anymore. They were about presents, about showing up. Every year, without fail, Ethan was there. And every time he blew out the candles on my cake with me, I'd think back to that one lonely morning when I ate a slice of chocolate cake alone. The day I thought I'd lost my son for good. But I hadn't. I just needed to remind him what truly mattered. Revenge had given me satisfaction, yes, but forgiveness that had given me peace. And as I grew older, I learned one last truth. Sometimes, love needs to break before it can be rebuilt. And when it is, it's stronger than ever. That was the gift my son gave me, even if it took him 5 long years to deliver it. Years passed, and that quiet peace stayed with me like a familiar melody. Soft, steady, and comforting. The bitterness that once kept me awake at night had faded into something gentler, like a scar that no longer hurt when touched. Ethan and I had found a rhythm again. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Every Sunday he came over for lunch. Sometimes with his wife, sometimes with my grandson, sometimes just him. We'd talk about work, about life, about things we'd never bothered to share before. It amazed me how easy it was to be proud of him again once I stopped expecting perfection. He wasn't the reckless, prideful young man he used to be. He'd learned the hard way, the same way I had, through loss, through consequence, through humility. One evening, we were sitting on the porch, the sun dipping low behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. Ethan leaned back in his chair and said quietly, "Dad, I've been thinking a lot about that day, the one when you canceled the funding. I hated you for it at the time. I thought you'd betrayed me." I smiled faintly. "And now," he chuckled, "now I think it's the best thing that ever happened to me. You didn't just take away the money, you took away my excuses." I turned to him. "That's the thing about failure, son. It teaches you what success never can." He nodded slowly, taking that in. "I just wish I'd realized it sooner." I looked out over the yard, where my grandson was chasing fireflies in the twilight. "We all wish that," I said. "But sometimes, life doesn't wait for us to be ready. It teaches us whether we want it to or not." He sat quietly after that, just watching his boy laugh in the fading light. And for a long time, neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The silence said enough. When he finally stood to leave that night, he hugged me, really hugged me, the way he used to when he was a kid. "Thanks for not giving up on me," he said again, his voice steady this time, not apologetic. I smiled. That's what fathers do, even when we want to. After he drove away, I sat there for a while longer, the porch light buzzing softly above me, the night settling in like an old friend. I thought about how strange life can be, how something as small as a forgotten birthday could unravel years of resentment and build something stronger in its place. A few months later, I received a letter in the mail. It was from Ethan's son, my grandson, for my birthday. Inside was a drawing just like the ones his father used to make. It showed the 3 of us standing together under a big sun, smiling. Above it, in clumsy handwriting, he'd written, "Happy birthday, Grandpa. Dad says you taught him what really matters." I laughed quietly when I read it, the kind of laugh that's half joy, half disbelief. I pinned the drawing on the fridge, right next to one of Ethan's old birthday cards from when he was small. Looking at the 2 of them side by side, I felt something deep and certain settle in my chest, a sense that everything had come full circle. I had once thought revenge was justice. I had thought taking back what was mine would bring me peace. But peace didn't come from control or pride. It came from letting go, from giving life enough space to heal itself. Now, every year when my birthday comes around, I don't wait for a call that never comes. I open the door to the sound of laughter, to the smell of chocolate cake, to the warmth of family that was lost and found again. And as the candles flicker and my grandson insists I make a wish, I always close my eyes and think the same thing. May he never forget what his father once did and what I finally learned. Because love, once broken and mended, becomes something unshakable. And as long as they remember that, as long as they remember me, then the years, the mistakes, and even the silence were worth it. That's how the story ends. Not with revenge, not with regret, but with understanding. And as I blow out the candles, surrounded by the family I almost lost, I realize that sometimes the best lessons are the ones that take the longest to learn. The candles flickered one last time before giving in to the soft breath of my grandson's laughter. The room filled with that warm, golden light that only family can create, not from the flames themselves, but from the people gathered around them. I looked at Ethan then, standing by the kitchen counter with his arm around his wife, watching his boy grin with frosting on his chin. For a second, he caught my gaze and we both smiled, no words, no need. That small look said everything. Said we made it. Said thank you. Said I understand now. After the cake and stories and laughter, when everyone had gone home, I sat alone in the quiet once again. But this time, it wasn't the kind of quiet that felt heavy. It was the kind that holds peace, the kind that wraps around you like an old blanket. The old clock ticked softly on the wall. I glanced up at it and thought about all the birthdays that had passed in silence. The years when I'd eaten my cake alone, waiting for a call that never came. It all seemed so far away now, like a different lifetime. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the night was calm. The moonlight spilling across the yard, silver and still. There was a faint reflection of my face in the glass. Older, lined, but not tired. Not anymore. I thought of my wife then, her laugh, her patience, the way she used to tell me, "One day, they'll see what really matters." She'd been right, as she so often was. I whispered softly into the empty room, "You were right, love." He found his way. The wind stirred outside, rustling the trees, and for a brief moment, I could almost swear I heard her laugh, faint like a memory. I walked back to the table and gathered the plates, the leftover cake, the half-empty glasses. It felt good, this simple act of cleaning up after a full house. It meant the house had been alive again. Before turning in for the night, I passed the fridge. The two drawings, Ethan's old one and his son's new one, hung there side by side. The past and present, connected by crayons and love. I smiled, reached out, and straightened them just slightly, a quiet gesture to the years that had finally found their peace. Then, with a soft sigh, I turned off the lights. The house settled around me, the way old houses do when they're content. Wood creaking, pipes humming softly, the rhythm of a life well lived. I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about how strange it all was. How a single forgotten birthday had once felt like the end of everything, and how, in its own way, it had been the beginning instead. Sometimes, life breaks what needs fixing. Sometimes, love takes the long way home. And as I drifted off to sleep, I realized that forgiveness hadn't just healed my son, it had healed me. Years later, when I'd grown too old to host the birthday dinners myself, Ethan took over. He made sure the family gathered, that the cake was the same, chocolate with thick frosting, just how I liked it. And every year, when my grandson brought out the candles and they all sang, Ethan would always glance my way, smile, and say the same line, "Don't worry, Dad, I didn't forget." And I'd nod, smiling back through the years, through all that had been lost and found again. Because now he never did. And that was the real gift. Not the money, not the success, not even the forgiveness, but the knowing that he remembered, that he cared, that, after all the silence and pride and pain, love had come home again. And so, as the candles flickered one last time, I'd close my eyes and make my wish. Not for myself this time, but for him. May he never forget what truly matters. And with that thought, every year, I'd blow out the candles, and the room would fill with light. When I think about it now, sitting here in the quiet of my later years, I realize that life has a funny way of circling back. The things that once tore you apart have a way of stitching you together again. Not perfectly, not seamlessly, but honestly. Ethan visits me almost every weekend now. He doesn't come for advice or out of guilt anymore. He comes because he wants to. He brings his son, sometimes his wife, sometimes just himself. We sit on the same porch we used to argue on, sipping coffee as the morning light filters through the trees. The conversations are easy. Sometimes we talk about business, sometimes about the old days, and sometimes we don't talk at all. The silence doesn't sting anymore. It feels like understanding. He runs a successful company now, not mine, his, built from the ground up, with the scars of failure as its foundation. I see in him a man I barely recognize, and yet, one I'm deeply proud of. He tells me he mentors young entrepreneurs now, and every time he does, I can't help but smile. Because I know that, somewhere in those lessons, he tells them about a stubborn old man who once refused to write a check, and changed his life because of it. One afternoon, as we sat watching his son play in the yard, Ethan said, "You know, Dad, sometimes I wonder what would have happened if you'd said yes back then." I looked at him for a long moment. "You'd probably have the business you wanted, and none of the lessons you needed." He grinned. "Yeah, I figured you'd say that." We both laughed quietly, and then he said something that caught me off guard. "Dad, I don't think I ever told you this, but when things went bad, when I lost everything, I used to think you didn't care. But after all this time, I get it. You weren't punishing me. You were pushing me." I didn't answer right away. I just nodded. Sometimes the truth doesn't need words. The sun began to dip, and for a moment, I caught our reflections in the window. Two men, side by side. One who had made mistakes and one who had learned from them. Both changed by the same lesson. When they left that evening, my grandson ran back up the steps before getting in the car. "Grandpa," he said, holding something behind his back, "Dad said you like surprises." He handed me a small, handmade card. On the front, in big, uneven letters, it said, "Happy birthday, Grandpa. We'll never forget." I felt my throat tighten as I opened it. Inside was a photo of me, Ethan, and his boy at last year's celebration. Beneath it, Ethan had written, "For all the birthdays I missed, thank you for never missing mine." That night, after they left, I placed the card beside the drawings on the fridge. 3 generations, 3 simple reminders that time heals what pride breaks. As I turned off the lights and walked toward my room, I paused by the window again. The moon hung low, silver and soft, and for the first time in a long while, I felt complete. I realized that revenge, even when justified, fades quickly. But redemption, that stays. Because this wasn't just my story of being forgotten and remembered. It was a story of becoming whole again. Of a son who lost his way, a father who found patience, and a family that learned love doesn't always speak. Sometimes, it just shows up. And as the night settled around me, I whispered the same quiet wish I'd made every year since that first forgotten birthday. Let him always remember, not me, but what I stood for. Then I smiled, closed my eyes, and drifted to sleep with peace in my heart. Because this time I knew he would. Years passed gently after that, as they tend to when life finds its balance. Seasons changed, birthdays came and went, and the rhythm of family became something I no longer took for granted. I grew older, slower, perhaps, but not lonely. The house that once echoed with silence now buzzed with laughter on weekends. My grandson's sneakers left scuff marks on the wooden floors, and I never once asked him to stop. Every mark, every sound, was proof that love had returned home. Ethan had turned into the kind of man I always hoped he'd become. Not rich in the way he once chased, but rich in purpose, patience, and perspective. He took care of his people, treated his employees with respect, and made time for his family. One summer afternoon, we sat out in the backyard, the scent of cut grass mixing with the smoke from the grill. My grandson was running around with the dog, chasing bubbles that caught the sunlight like little pieces of gold. Ethan handed me a glass of lemonade and said, "You know, Dad, I've been thinking, I want you to retire, really retire. No more side projects, no more consulting. Just enjoy yourself." I smiled. "I tried that once, remember? Didn't quite stick." He laughed. "Yeah, but now you've got a better reason to try again." He nodded toward his son, who was now sitting in the grass, blowing bubbles with fierce concentration. I took a slow sip, the ice clinking softly in the glass. "You're right. Maybe it's time." He looked at me, serious for a moment. "You did enough, Dad. You built everything we stand on. You don't owe the world anything more." I studied his face, older now, lined with responsibility and love, and I realized something profound. He had become the man I'd always hoped to be. Later that evening, as the sun sank behind the trees and the cicadas started their nightly song, Ethan gathered his family to leave. My grandson hugged me tightly, then looked up with a grin. "See you next weekend, Grandpa. Don't forget, it's your turn to make the cake this time." I laughed, ruffling his hair. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." When the car pulled away, I stood on the porch for a while, listening to the fading hum of the engine. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of summer, and for the first time in my long life, I didn't feel like I was waiting for anything. The past, the anger, the hurt, the disappointment had long lost its edge. What remained was something stronger, something quieter, contentment. As I stepped inside, my eyes fell again on that small collage on the fridge. The drawings, the photo, the birthday card. Time had yellowed the paper, but not the meaning. I traced my fingers over the words. "We'll never forget." That night I wrote a letter. Not a will, not a speech, just a note. I placed it in the drawer of my bedside table, where I knew Ethan would one day find it. It said, "Son, you taught me that love doesn't need to be loud to be real. I once thought I needed to teach you strength, but it turns out you taught me grace. If you ever doubt yourself, remember this. You are everything I could have hoped for. Love, Dad." I folded it neatly, turned off the light, and lay back, listening to the soft hum of life around me. And in that quiet moment, I understood something I never had before. That revenge may give you satisfaction, but forgiveness gives you freedom. Because when you stop keeping score, when you finally let go of what's owed and start cherishing what's given, that's when life begins again. So I closed my eyes with a smile, knowing that the story, my story, didn't end in bitterness or triumph. It ended in peace. And that, I realized, was the best revenge of all. The next morning, sunlight crept gently across my room. The kind of soft light that feels like a whisper rather than a wake-up call. The air smelled faintly of coffee from the kitchen downstairs. Ethan must have let himself in again, just like he always did on Saturdays. I took my time getting up, every joint reminding me that years had quietly added their weight. As I reached the doorway, I paused for a moment. The house was filled with the familiar sound of family. Laughter, dishes clinking, a child's voice asking too many questions at once. When I stepped into the kitchen, Ethan was there, apron on, trying to flip pancakes while his son stood beside him, holding a bowl that was clearly too big for him. "Morning, Dad," Ethan said with that easy grin of his. "We figured we'd beat you to it this time." I chuckled, leaning on the counter. "So I see. You're even using my secret recipe." My grandson giggled. "Dad said it's not a secret if you tell everyone it's the best pancakes ever." I laughed. The kind of laugh that doesn't come from amusement, but from joy. It filled the room, wrapped around us all. We sat down to eat together, the sunlight catching on the syrup as it dripped from one plate to another. My grandson chattered about school, about how he wanted to be an inventor one day. Ethan just smiled, letting him dream out loud. At one point, my grandson asked, "Grandpa, what did you do before you got old?" Ethan nearly choked on his coffee, but I just smiled. "I built things, not just buildings or companies, but people." The boy tilted his head, confused. "People?" I nodded. "Sometimes the hardest thing you'll ever build is someone's confidence, or their trust, or their heart. But if you do it right, it lasts longer than anything else." Ethan looked at me then, and I could see that he understood exactly what I meant. After breakfast, while my grandson ran off to play, Ethan and I stepped out onto the porch again. The air was warm, the garden alive with color. "You ever regret it?" he asked suddenly. "Regret what?" "Canceling the funding, making me go through all that." I thought about it for a long moment. "I used to," I said softly. "I used to think maybe I was too hard on you. But now, no. Because if I hadn't, you wouldn't be standing here the man you are." He nodded slowly, his expression unreadable. Then he said something that stopped me cold. "You know, Dad, when my boy grows up, I hope I have the courage to do what you did. To love him enough to let him fail." My throat tightened. I wanted to say something, but the words caught somewhere between pride and gratitude. So instead, I put my hand on his shoulder and squeezed once. That was enough. Later, as they left for the day, My grandson ran back up the steps again, always the same, and threw his arms around me. "See you soon, Grandpa," he said. And then, as if remembering something, he added, "Don't forget us." I bent down, smiling. "Kiddo, I couldn't forget you if I tried." He grinned, satisfied, and ran back to the car. When the sound of their laughter finally faded down the road, I stood there for a while, letting the peace of the moment settle around me. The wind moved through the trees, slow and gentle, carrying with it the echoes of years gone by, of missed birthdays, of arguments, of silence. But none of it hurt anymore. It was all part of the same song now. Inside, the fridge still hummed quietly, holding its collage of memories. The drawings, the photos, the birthday cards. I looked at them one last time that day and whispered, "We did all right, didn't we?" The house didn't answer, it didn't need to, because the answer was already everywhere. In the laughter that lingered, in the warmth of a sun redeemed, in the love that had outlived pride. And for the first time in a long, long life, I felt certain of one thing, that the story I had lived was not one of revenge or retribution. It was one of restoration. And as the evening sun dipped low and painted the world in gold, I sat back in my chair, eyes closed, heart steady, and smiled to myself. Because this peace, this family, this forgiveness, was everything I'd ever wanted. And the man who had once been forgotten would never be forgotten again. That night, the world was quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels earned. I sat by the fireplace, the warmth brushing against my hands, the soft crackle of burning wood filling the silence. The house was dimly lit, but I liked it that way. There was something comforting about shadows when you've made peace with your past. On the small table beside me sat a glass of scotch, half full, next to an old photograph of me and Ethan when he was a boy. He was sitting on my shoulders, laughing, the same carefree laugh his son has now. I hadn't looked at that photo in years, but tonight it felt right to have it there. I picked it up, running my fingers over the edge of the frame. "We've come a long way, haven't we, kid?" I murmured. It was strange. I used to think that revenge had given me power, that teaching him a lesson by cutting him off had restored my dignity. But as I sat there in the stillness, I realized it wasn't revenge that had saved me. It was patience, time, and love that refused to die even when wounded. A knock came at the door, gentle, hesitant. I wasn't expecting anyone. When I opened it, Ethan stood there, hands in his pockets, a sheepish smile on his face. "Sorry, Dad. I know it's late." I smiled. "You're lucky I'm still awake. Everything all right?" He nodded, stepping inside. "Yeah, I just couldn't sleep." We sat down by the fire, the same way we used to after his mother passed. No words for a while, just the comfort of shared silence. Finally, he said, "I was thinking about what you said today, about building people. I don't think I ever told you. I started a scholarship fund for young entrepreneurs who can't afford to start." I raised my brows. "That's so?" He nodded. "Yeah, I named it after you." I blinked. "After me? The Harold Cross Foundation," he said quietly. "For people who need someone to believe in them, even when they don't deserve it yet." For a moment I couldn't speak. My throat tightened in a way I hadn't felt in years. "I wanted you to know," he continued, "because everything I've built, it started with what you didn't give me. That no was the best gift I ever got." I chuckled softly, the sound breaking the emotion that hung between us. "You know, son, I used to think I was teaching you responsibility. Turns out, you were teaching me faith." He smiled. "Guess we both learned something then." We sat there until the fire burned low, talking about everything and nothing, the kind of talk only fathers and sons can have after years of distance. When he finally left, he hugged me tighter than he ever had before. "Love you, Dad," he said. I held him back, strong despite the tremor in my hands. "I know, son. I love you too." After he drove away, I stood at the doorway for a long time, watching the red taillights fade into the darkness. The night air was cool, the stars bright and clear. I took a deep breath, the kind that fills your chest with something more than air, and smiled. Inside, I placed the photo back on the table beside the glass. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt full of life, of forgiveness, of second chances. I leaned back in my chair, staring into the dying fire, and whispered to the flames, "You did good, son. Better than I ever could have dreamed." And as the embers glowed their last, I felt something inside me settle, like the final page of a story closing gently. Because that's what it was now, a finished story. Not of revenge, not of regret, but of redemption. And as I drifted into sleep, the last thought that crossed my mind wasn't of what I'd lost, or even what I'd regained. It was of legacy. Not the kind written in wills or bank accounts, but the kind written in hearts. Because the greatest revenge, I finally understood, is not proving others wrong. It's helping them become right. And in that quiet, peaceful house, surrounded by the ghosts of laughter and love that once seemed gone forever, I knew I had done just that. The days that followed passed with a kind of soft rhythm, calm, predictable, and strangely beautiful. My mornings were filled with small routines that once felt lonely but now carried a kind of warmth. The sound of the kettle boiling, the birds gathering outside the kitchen window, the faint hum of life beyond the walls. Every week Ethan called. Not because he had to, but because he wanted to. Sometimes the calls were short, a quick check-in about work or the weather. Sometimes they stretched into long, meandering conversations that wandered through memories and laughter. One evening, he said, "Dad, I've been meaning to ask, what was the hardest part? When I left, when I didn't call." I was quiet for a moment. "The silence," I said finally. "It wasn't the anger or the disappointment. It was waking up every day and not hearing your voice. Not knowing if I'd lost you for good." He sighed softly. "I think I lost myself too for a while." "Yeah," I said, smiling faintly. "But you found your way home." He didn't answer, but I heard the emotion in his breathing. That was enough. When the call ended, I sat for a while, letting the quiet fill the room again. But this time, silence didn't feel empty. Felt earned. Felt peaceful. A few months later, Ethan invited me to a small ceremony for the scholarship fund. I didn't think much of it, just a formal event, I figured. But when I arrived, I saw my name printed across the banner in bold letters. The Harold Cross Foundation. Building tomorrow, one dream at a time. I stood there for a long moment, staring at it. I'd built companies, managed hundreds of people, handled millions of dollars, but nothing had ever felt quite like that moment. It wasn't pride I felt. It was gratitude. During his speech, Ethan said, "When I was young, I thought success came from having everything handed to you. My father taught me that real success comes from earning it, and that sometimes love looks a lot like tough lessons. This foundation exists because of one of those lessons." When the audience clapped, I couldn't look up. My throat had tightened too much. After the event, Ethan came over and handed me a plaque. It had my name etched into it, along with the words, "For the man who taught me that the greatest gift isn't money, it's belief." I couldn't say a word. I just put my hand on his shoulder and nodded. That night, when I got home, I hung the plaque in my study, right above the photo of the two of us from years ago. I stood there for a long time, taking it all in. The years of distance, of anger, of regret. They all felt small now, swallowed by something far bigger. As I sat down in my old chair, the one that had seen me through so many lonely nights, I smiled. Life has a way of humbling you before it rewards you. It strips away what you think you need until all that's left is what truly matters. And in that stillness, you see what was always there: love, waiting patiently beneath the noise. A few weeks later, my grandson came over. He ran straight into my study, pointing at the plaque on the wall. "Grandpa, is that you? Dad says you helped a lot of people." I laughed softly. "I just helped your dad, kiddo. He's the one helping everyone else." He grinned. "Then I want to help people too." I ruffled his hair. "Good. That's the best thing you could ever do." He climbed onto my lap, holding the same photograph I'd kept for decades. "You look happy here," he said. I looked at the picture. The younger me, strong and confident, carrying a laughing boy on his shoulders. I was. I said softly. But I'm happier now. He frowned. Why? Because back then, I said, smiling at him, I didn't know how the story would end. He leaned against me, eyes heavy with sleep. How does it end? He mumbled. I looked out the window, where the evening light spilled across the fields, and whispered, with love, kiddo, always with love. And as he drifted off in my arms, I realized the truth I'd been chasing all my life. It was never about revenge. It was never about being right. It was about building something that outlasts pain. Forgiveness, family, legacy. That's what endures. And as I sat there, holding the next generation of our family in my arms, I knew that my life, every failure, every wound, every quiet victory, had led me right here, exactly where I was always meant to be. The fire had long gone out, but the warmth lingered in the house, not from the flames, but from the laughter and life that now filled its rooms. Time had softened everything. The walls that once held echoes of silence, the photos that once brought ache instead of pride, even the old armchair by the window that had been my only companion for so many years. I spent more time outside these days. Mornings were for slow walks through the garden, afternoons for coffee on the porch. Sometimes Ethan joined me, sometimes my grandson did. Sometimes neither came, and that was all right too, because for the first time in my life, I knew they would always come back. One autumn afternoon, when the air was crisp and the leaves painted the ground in gold, Ethan arrived unannounced, holding something behind his back. "Close your eyes, Dad," he said, that boyish grin returning for a moment. I chuckled. "You're a grown man, Ethan. Do I really need to play along? Just this once." I sighed, humoring him, and shut my eyes. "Okay," he said after a moment. "You can look." When I opened them, there in his hands was a framed document. A legal one. "What's this?" I asked. "It's for you," he said, setting it on the table. "I registered the deed this morning. The house is yours free and clear. No taxes, no fees, nothing. Consider it a thank you." I frowned. "Ethan, I already—" He held up a hand. "No. Listen. You gave me everything I needed, even when I didn't deserve it. You taught me what love looks like when it's not easy. So this is just my way of saying that every brick, every window, every memory in this house, it's not just yours. It's part of who I am too." For a moment I couldn't speak. I just stared at him, my throat tight, my eyes burning in a way I hadn't expected. He smiled faintly. "Guess we've both done our share of giving and taking, huh?" I chuckled softly. "Yeah. Though I think you're catching up." He looked around the house, his gaze lingering on the old photos, the small scuffs on the door frames, the faint marks of years lived fully. "This place feels different now," he said. "It feels alive again." "It's because we stopped filling it with silence," I replied, "and started filling it with forgiveness." He nodded, his expression distant but peaceful. "You were right, you know. Love's not loud. It's quiet, steady. Just like life," I said. "The noise fades, but the meaning stays." That night, after he left, I sat in that same chair by the window, the deed resting on the table beside me. The house creaked gently. The trees outside whispered against the wind. I thought of the years gone by, the forgotten birthdays, the angry phone calls, the long stretches of nothing. All the mistakes, all the stubborn pride, all the chances almost missed. And yet, somehow, love had found its way through all of it. It had waited. It had endured. It had outlasted ego, silence, and time. I took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and whispered into the dim room, "You did good, son." The words hung there for a while, soft and sure. In the days that followed, I started writing again. Not business letters or plans, but reflections. Small stories, lessons learned, memories worth keeping. Ethan found them once and called them Dad's second book. I told him it wasn't a book. It was a map for him, for his son, for anyone who needed a reminder that mistakes don't end you. They shape you. And when my grandson asked me one day, "Grandpa, what's the most important thing you ever built?" I smiled and said, "This, right here, us." He didn't understand then, not fully. But one day he will. Because love that survives disappointment, love that rebuilds itself, becomes unbreakable. And when my time finally comes, I know I'll leave this world with no regrets. My house will still stand, filled with the sound of family, of laughter, of life. My son will keep telling the story, not of revenge, not of anger, but of love that found its way home. And that story, our story, will outlive us both. Because in the end, I didn't just teach my son how to build a business. I taught him how to build a legacy. And together we built something far greater than wealth. We built forgiveness. We built understanding. We built love, the kind that never forgets. Years later, when the seasons had turned a few more times and the edges of my hair had gone silver, I often found myself sitting on that same porch, the one where it all began and where everything finally came full circle. The sun would dip low, painting the sky in soft gold and rose, and I'd watch the world move quietly, content in a way I never thought I'd be again. Ethan visited often, sometimes with his wife, sometimes with his little boy who now called me Grandpa Hell. Each visit felt like a gentle reminder that time can heal even the deepest wounds, if you give it patience and grace. We didn't talk about the past anymore. We didn't need to. The apologies had already been spoken, the lessons already learned. Now all that was left was peace. One evening, after they left, I sat alone again, the twilight wrapping around me like an old friend. The cicadas sang, the breeze carried the scent of rain, and the house behind me glowed softly from the inside, warm, lived in, alive. I thought of how easily I could have lost all of it. One bitter decision, one unspoken word, one moment of pride could have erased everything. But somehow life had given me another chance, to forgive, to love, to be loved again. I smiled, closing my eyes. The weight I'd carried for years had finally lifted. There was no revenge anymore, no resentment, no need to prove a point. Only gratitude, quiet, steady, and real. Because in the end, what mattered wasn't the money, or the business, or even the lessons. It was the laughter that filled the house again. The arms that hugged me without hesitation. The love that had once been broken but came back stronger than ever. I realized then that the greatest victory isn't in making others regret losing you. It's in becoming the kind of person they'll never forget. As the first stars appeared overhead, I whispered softly into the night, "You did good, Ethan. You finally got it right." And maybe, just maybe, I did too. Because forgiveness had turned my revenge into redemption, and my silence into peace. And that, I thought with a quiet smile, is the only ending worth having.